Hi, everybody. I'm so glad that you decided to stop here and learn about relationship therapy theories. And I am Dr. Doug. And whether you are one of my real life students or a YouTube student, I'm still glad to see you here. Today, we're going to be talking about psychodynamic couple therapy. So let's get started. This is one of my just standard slides that I use at the beginning of these lectures just to give a bit of a disclaimer about not using the term couple therapy or marital therapy, although that may be the terms that you're maybe the most familiar with. But for my purposes, I will be referring to it as relationship therapy and calling partners partners rather than spouses or girlfriend, boyfriend. And here's our agenda, which probably looks familiar to you if this is not the only video that you've watched of mine. It's a standard agenda so that every theory you can feel confident that you are getting all of your bases covered. When we're looking at psychodynamic theory, for today, I'm not going to go too deep into psychodynamic theory itself, all by itself, separate from couple therapy, because that can sort of be just an enormous lecture all by itself. However, I do want you to know some basics just so that the couple therapy part, makes sense. So when we are looking at couple therapy, psychodynamic theory, a lot of times people will just think about Freud. And I think, with movies or with whatever popular media, everyone has heard of Freud and sort of some of the basic concepts but when we're looking at psychodynamic theory, it actually is much more complex and has gone way beyond just the work of Freud. So, one of the major theorists is Otto Kernberg, who did work around the idea of splitting, where our internal representation of ourself, of people, of the world can sometimes split into all good or all bad. And as we developmentally mature, the hope is that rather than perceiving ourselves or other people in either of those extreme camps, that we will instead get to this moderate place where people are just good enough. And it is not a matter of, oh, I'm just horrible or, oh, I'm the best, but I'm doing pretty good and you're okay. Uh, so that would be sort of the goal of developmental maturity. So Kernberg talked about, in terms of this idea of splitting, he was saying that for some people, there may be these borderline constructs, basically, where if you have these borderline type of tendencies, it may be that you are trying to protect the all good part of yourself and of other people. And the all bad part is so bad and so scary that you try to keep that locked away. But then when things happen, which are disappointing, which sort of put like a mar into that idea of all good, you know, someone has disappointed me, someone has made me angry, I have disappointed myself, then all of a sudden the gates are just open to that all bad part. And then you see the person will become very reactive and maybe shift very quickly from being very enamored or very happy or very satisfied to all of a sudden very, very much not satisfied. Because now it is like, oh, now we're in the all bad place. And so they shift in order to sort of adapt to that new situation. Another aspect of splitting rather than just borderline, there's also this other component called the narcissistic structures. And what that is saying is it's also the same idea of splitting, where the person will try to protect their all good part. So they put their all good part out there, out in front. That's the part that they show the world. And they are so incredibly reliant on other people to reflect that back to them as evidence that, oh, I am indeed all good. But when other people do things that indicate that, oh, I'm seeing something other than just all good from you, then all of a sudden, again, you'll sort of get this big reaction where now they are suddenly terrified that maybe they aren't all good and maybe, in fact, they're all bad. And then they will oftentimes become angry or frustrated or somehow a bad reaction towards you for making me feel that way, sort of making me feel like I'm an all bad person. So those are sort of the idea of splitting, like very simplified. Another theorist, Heinz Kohut, talked about this internal representation that we have of ourselves, and that for some people, in order for that to be fostered, that they really need that reflected back to them from other people. And so oftentimes those types of folks will need lots of affirmation from other people. And that without that affirmation, then I start to question, like, how good of a person am I? How valuable? How much am I appreciated? And it's very difficult for those types of people to hold on to a strong, positive self concept without those affirmations from the outside. And then the final theorist who was a major player in psychodynamic theory is Margaret Mahler, who did a tremendous amount of work around developmental stages. And so, what are the things that happen, that ideally will happen during those first several years of life, that will lay the foundation for how we are as adults? And so it is during those first several years that we learn to trust others, trust ourselves, trust the world, sort of feel confident, feel like we can go out and explore, and we get our basic needs met so that we can sort of fulfill our greatest potential. And for adults, sometimes what you'll see is that there are maybe echoes of what had occurred when we were kids, and that if any of those needs were not met and we didn't advance through that particular developmental stage, then we start to see how that impacts us as adults. And for the purposes of today, we'll see that not only Margaret Mahler's work, but the other theorists, that those needs, those desires, those drives, those reactions to others play a major part when it comes to working with relationships, working in relationship theory. The first of these guiding beliefs are that hidden and unresolved conflicts will impact your current relationships. And those are conflicts that had occurred in the past, and we'll hear more about that. The second point about insight into the unconscious, with that insight, if clients can build that insight, then they can use that in order to solve their own problems within the relationships and to develop and continue to grow. The third of these points is that partners choose each other for a reason. So psychodynamic theory would say that there are one of maybe three possible reasons why you would choose the partners that you choose. One of them may be that that person somehow represents a person that you lost, whether that is like literally, you no longer have a relationship with this person, or that there was some relationship where there was a rift, or you just were never as close to them as you wanted to be, or there was some kind of problem, some kind of unresolved conflict. And so you choose a partner who somehow will help you right that wrong from the past. And there are multiple reasons why that might happen, and we won't go into that right now. The second reason that we might choose a partner is because the partner represents something that we are actually quite proud about in ourselves. But for some reason, it's not okay for us to sort of really revel in that. And so instead, we pick a partner who embodies that strength or that thing that we're proud of, and we can instead sort of indicate pride in them. And the third reason why we might pick a particular type of partner would be that the partner represents something in ourselves that we're actually quite ashamed of. And if we can sort of fix it in the other person, then it will, in our minds, fix it within ourselves. I thought that this slide is helpful because it provides a pretty good overview of why it would even be helpful to use psychodynamic theory with relationship clients. The first part of this quote is talking about how when we're conceptualizing these cases, that the difficulties that are happening in the relationship that we are treating, that instead of attributing that to flaws in the people or flaws in the way that the two of you or however many people are in the relationship, the way that the partners are carrying on the relationship, that it's not really that there's no blame to be laid, but rather that the difficulties that the relationships are having are traced back to unresolved conflicts from the past. And so, if we can build the insight, if we can change the expectations, if we can sort of make the hidden unhidden and help people to become just much more aware and intentional, that can then have a much more positive impact on these relationships. The process of psychodynamic theory, when we're using it with relationships, you see that there are 5 points here. And the one is that sessions are unstructured. So does that mean like Wild West? No, it doesn't mean Wild West. Uh, what that basically means is, that contrary to like Bowen theory, which is the video that I had done just prior to this one, where clients will bring an agenda in, you usually don't have an agenda when it comes to psychodynamic theory. But instead, you are working with what the clients are bringing you for that particular session. The length of the treatment will just go as long as it needs to, whether that is a couple of sessions or a couple dozen sessions or more. It will be done when it's done. And that will be directed by either the clients or the provider, and having some kind of conversation of trying to determine whether it is time to end or not. In psychodynamic theory, with relationships, usually you will see the partners together, although there may be situations where it would be helpful to see the individuals. You may have a sense that one of the partners doesn't feel comfortable talking extensively about something. And so you notice in session that they are like very closed mouthed about certain topics, or that you get the sense that something is just not being said. And so it may be that you suggest that you have sessions with just the individuals, or like oftentimes what I'll do is I'll say, like, can we do 20 minutes and 20 minutes with each of you? And then we'll come back together and talk about what was talked about in those individual sessions. And so in that way, you have an opportunity to meet with them as individuals, but you are still holding on to the energy of it being relationship therapy rather than individual. This third point about the therapy being relational and emotional. So, if you had watched the video on Bowen, you can sort of imagine that in a Bowen session, things are very heady, intellectual, rational. And in psychodynamic therapy, that is definitely not the case. So, people are very emotional, arguments will break out, emotions will run high. And you are using that to an extent in treatment, and you are also managing it, which we'll talk about later when we talk about the role that the therapist plays. This final point about that you may have a co-therapist, this is a little bit unusual. There's really no other theories where it is as common to have a co-therapist in terms of relationship therapy. And if you think about it, well, maybe you can't think about it yet because we haven't gone into the theory yet. Uh, but what you will learn is that the because of the nature of what is discussed in these sessions, that it can be very triggering for a therapist. And if the therapist is being triggered, it would be helpful to have a co-therapist who will sort of pick up the ball, maybe alert you that maybe you are being triggered and maybe you're not even aware of it, or they sense that you are being triggered and so then they step in, and the two of you just sort of balance each other out and support each other through the session. Because these sessions can be very emotionally and intellectually difficult for a single therapist. And so oftentimes you'll see that they have co-therapists. In psychodynamic therapy, then, when we're working with relationships, what is the therapist focusing on? And we have four basic things here that the therapist would be focusing on. So the first of these is underlying issues. And so what do we mean by that? We're looking at what is happening, what has happened in the past, and how does that need to be managed today? And so we are exploring patterns. We are looking at what kinds of behaviors have happened, helping the clients, to accept ambivalence, to understand why they are acting the way that they act. And we are trying to identify patterns rather than casting blame on anybody. As I sort of mentioned, I think just a few minutes ago, that we are not blaming, but instead looking at, like, how did these things come to be today? And we sort of trace it to something that has happened in the past. And another part of this underlying issues is helping the clients to understand what their needs are and how they can actually get those met. The second focus for the therapist is transference. And transference is when clients will transfer the feelings that they have toward a third party onto the therapist. So let's think of an example. Let's say that I have lots of resentment against my mother because she will often cut me off when I'm trying to talk. And so as a result, I feel like she doesn't really care what I'm saying. She's not really listening to me. I have very little value in her eyes. And so in session, maybe the therapist cuts me off very innocently, and all of a sudden the client will sort of really have a big emotional reaction, much bigger than you would think would be called for by this sort of small thing that's happened. And so the reason why that emotion is so big is because they are transferring feelings about the mother or whoever it was onto the therapist. And what can then happen in response is called countertransference, where sort of you have transferred this onto me, and then me, because of my past, something comes up, I'm triggered, and then I sort of have this countertransference where I am now having this big emotional reaction to your reaction. So I've taken it personally because something has been triggered within me. And this transference countertransference is actually an enormous tool in psychodynamic theory. And therapists will all experience countertransference. And the trick is, do you know yourself well enough to recognize when that countertransference is happening? And when it does, do you have enough knowledge and experience and insight to understand why that's happening? And what can that tell you about what is actually happening with the client? So, that countertransference, you're using it as a tool to get a sense for something that's happening with the client that is not actually being stated. It's wonderful. It's a fantastic tool as long as you have the knowledge, insight, and experience to know what to do with it. If you don't, then that is called sort of a blind spot. We're sort of being hit, not knowing that we're being hit, or not understanding why we're being hit. With acceptance and subjectivity, what this is talking about is helping clients to develop that ability to accept reality rather than wishing that things were a different way or demanding that things be a different way. So accepting that this is reality, and that's sort of a starting place for how we can process. And then the subjectivity is helping clients to understand that we all have different subjective experiences, and you and your partner and you and I likely see things differently. And that doesn't mean that either of us is seeing things wrong. It is just that our perception, our subjective experience is different. And we call that a divergent subjective experience. I know it's very, very tricky. Uh, it's very, very good. It's a good explanation. So, a divergent subjective experience and helping clients to then realize that, oh, what you're talking about is your truth. My partner is talking about their truth. It's not that they are lying or trying to undermine me, not necessarily. And when we can understand that this is their subjective reality, then we can also exercise empathy. And when the clients can show empathy for each other, that is a huge method of helping them to grow closer and to sort of reconnect those binds that are between them. And then the final group of ideas that the therapist will be focusing on during these sessions are any of the defenses that we sort of see happening in the room or that they are talking about. So there are many, many defenses within psychodynamic theory, and you should definitely look those up. The ones that I have written here on the slide are really just the tip of the iceberg. So just briefly to talk about these. The first of these is projective identification, and this is sort of a big one that we will often see in session, where I have an unwanted part of myself, something that I'm ashamed of, something I don't like about myself, and I project that onto my partner. So, it could be as innocent as maybe I am nervous that I don't have a very good sense of humor and that when I crack jokes, nobody laughs. So it's actually something that I feel very insecure about. And so then my partner cracks some kind of silly joke. And so I flip out on them of like, oh, you're so embarrassing. I'm so ashamed to be your partner. Can't you see how embarrassing this is? Nobody thinks you're funny. So this person, your partner, has just cracked this joke. All of a sudden, you are freaking out on them. And that big emotional reaction is a very good tip that projection is happening. So I'm projecting some unwanted part of myself onto you. And then the identification part happens when the receiver of that projection takes on that identity for themselves and then have their own emotional reaction. So, in the case of the example that I just used, my partner would then all of a sudden feel that shame of like, oh, people are laughing at me, not laughing with me. And my partner is ashamed to be with me, and I'm just this laughing stock, this ridiculous person. And so, in that state of shame and frustration, my partner then verbally lashes out at me, and now we're in a full blown fight, which has started because my partner cracked a joke. So, when we look back on these arguments that have sort of just grown very, very fast, very quickly, and we don't understand how this seemingly innocent thing has become this huge emotional eruption, oftentimes we can say that there was projective identification happening. Another one of the defenses that I list out here is splitting, which we already talked about, where the client, is sort of putting their partner into the all good camp or the all bad camp. And as a therapist, we are sort of helping them to go into the good enough camp instead. With esteem, we are trying to help the clients with building up their own self perception as well as their perception of their partner, and just building up that esteem and respect. And then finally is the idea of soothing and helping the clients to develop healthy, soothing, self soothing, which may be different from what they grew up with. And oftentimes, the clients who come in to see us, they may have not developed the best self soothing techniques. And so, when we are in session, we're sort of looking at what are they doing to self soothe, and is there a better or healthier way for them to do that? The role of the therapist, it can be split up into these four aspects of educate, mediate, nurture, and being neutral. And so with educate, what we're talking about is that the therapist is explaining the concepts, the systemic concepts, the psychodynamic concepts. The therapist is also educating the clients on the patterns that they're seeing, the behavioral patterns between, as well as the connections that the therapist is drawing between things that have happened in the past and how they are playing out in the present. The second of these is mediate. And what this says is that, clients are going to have high emotions, they're going to have disagreements, and our role is to make sure that both people, that all of the clients are feeling heard and understood and empathized with, and that the immediate concerns are being addressed. We're not just shutting that down and telling them to stop talking about this thing. However, this third component of nurture immediately comes in, where we, as the therapist, need to make sure that we have created a safe space for the clients. And so, in mediating these high emotions, these disagreements, that the clients still need to feel like the therapist has a handle on what's going on, and that things have not gotten out of control. Things are not going to just snowball and become just this huge, uncontrollable thing, but instead that the therapist is, pacing things, is modulating the emotions in the room, and can close that up whenever they want to. And so, in that way, the clients can feel safe to express whatever emotions that they want to express, knowing that the therapist will take care of them while they're in the room. And this last aspect of neutrality, this is not saying that you are this cold, unfeeling creature in the room. It, this idea of being the nurturer sort of goes right against that. So the clients should feel like you care and that you are interested, that you are invested, all of that. However, that you are neutral in terms of I'm not biased against any of the clients, and that I'm holding all of the clients in equal esteem, and that sort of there is I've created a blank slate for them to be able to project onto. So if I am disclosing too much about myself, if I am talking too much about my own history or my own thoughts or emotions, that it becomes harder and harder for the clients to project onto me. It becomes harder for there to be transference and countertransference happening. And as we've already discussed, those are sort of really important tools that we need to be able to use in psychodynamic theory. So we want to establish enough of a neutrality, enough of a blank slate, so that the clients can project and transfer onto us. These are the common interventions that you'll see in psychodynamic relationship therapy. So the first of these being interpretations of unconscious processes. So, if there's projection happening, if there's transference, countertransference, if we see these relationship patterns, if we are getting clues about unresolved conflicts from the past, that we are the one who is helping to interpret, put meaning onto that, and sharing that with the clients and processing that with them. So, right along with that would be educating them about the unresolved, the hidden conflicts that we are seeing and that we are sensing, and letting them know, like, what does that mean? Where did that come from? What is the connection to the past? This third point is then, we've sort of talked about the past, how it's affecting the present, what are the patterns, and now we help them to separate those where the past no longer has such a strong hold on the present, and instead we can create the separation. And then the final point is helping the clients to develop the skills to meet the needs that we've helped them to identify. And whether that is, doing something on your own to meet those needs, or skillfully and in a healthy way, asking your partner to help you meet those needs. The goals of psychodynamic therapy are really sort of can be generally categorized under these three categories of individual, patterns, and needs. So needs is what we were just talking about, being able to identify those needs and have the skills to address those needs. So that would be one set of goals. The second set of goals is this idea of patterns, of helping the couple to be able to recognize the patterns that are happening and understanding what the connection is between the past and the present, how that is playing out between us, and what we can do to intentionally separate the past and the present. So that would be a second set of goals. And then that other set of goals is about the individual. And this is hitting upon just the right amount of differentiation where there is an I, there is a we, and there is a healthy balance between those where there is not an excessive amount of reactivity to the other person, because I have developed enough of a differentiation and I have developed insight and awareness and acceptance, and that allows me to be very secure in who I am, and that allows my partner to also have their own thoughts and feelings about things, and for me to not take that personally. These are just some examples of thoughts that the psychodynamic therapist may be happening. And as you look through these, I'm hoping that you will recognize that the these are the questions that the therapist would be asking themselves in order to help move the client towards those goals of either that individual growth, understanding patterns, understanding and getting the needs met. And all of these questions that you would be asking yourself would be helping to determine like how to guide therapy at that point. Well, we're almost at the end, so thank you so much for sticking it out. Here are your takeaways from this lecture, sort of the main points that I hope that you remember about psychodynamic therapy when it comes to relationship clients. I just really want to thank you again for watching this video, and I hope that this was helpful to you, whether you are learning this because you have to or just because you're interested. And if you would like to be notified about any future lectures that I put out, make sure that you subscribe down below. And I would greatly, greatly appreciate a like also. And you might also be interested in checking out my other channel, Creative Psychology with Dr. Doug, where I just talk about general psych topics for anybody, not just students. And of course, I hope that you and your imperfections are continuing to develop a wonderfully harmonious relationship. Until next time.